They didn't take it all at once. Loss came quietly, like a slow leak you don't notice until the floor is soaked. First, it was the job. Not because I failed, but because I was replaceable. That was the word they used. Clean professional. Empty. I packed my desk into a cardboard box that used to hold printer paper and walked out as if nothing had happened. I told myself work was just work. I told myself I was more than a title. Then came the house, not stolen, just reassigned. Paperwork, signatures, polite smiles across a table. "This is how it has to be," they said. I nodded, because nodding was easier than admitting I was being erased room by room. Walls I once leaned against became someone else's backdrop. The door closed with a sound that felt permanent. Friends followed, not with goodbyes, with silence. Messages left unseen, invitations that stopped arriving. I learned that people don't abandon you loudly, they simply stop making space for you. One by one, chairs were pulled away from the table until I was the only one still sitting there. Then they took my reputation, not through lies, but through omission. My name stopped being mentioned. My work stopped being credited. In meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions were made about a life I was still living. I became a shadow in my own story. At some point, even my reflection changed. I looked older, not because of time, but because of weight. The kind you carry in your chest. I stopped recognizing myself in photos. I spoke less. When people asked how I was, I answered automatically fine. It became a reflex, a shield. They took my voice next. Not physically, something worse. They taught me that speaking had consequences. That explaining myself didn't fix anything. That defending the truth only exhausted me. Silence felt safer, smaller. I learned how to disappear while standing in the same room. One night, sitting alone, I realized how empty everything had become. No job, no home, no crowd, no certainty. It felt like standing in a burned field after the fire has passed, quiet, blackened, unrecognizable. And that's when it happened. They tried to take my name. Not the letters, but the meaning. They tried to reduce it to a mistake, a failure, a footnote. They wanted my name to carry shame instead of history. To mean what was lost instead of who I am. That was the moment something inside me stopped breaking. Because everything else was already gone. When you lose enough, fear loses its grip. When there's nothing left to protect, you finally see what cannot be taken. My name was still mine. It carried every step I took when no one watched. Every time I chose honesty when lying would have been easier. Every time I stayed when walking away would have been painless. My name remembered things they never saw. I realized identity isn't what you own. It's what remains when ownership is stripped away. They could take my position, but not my principles. They could erase my place, but not my presence. They could silence me, but not the truth I lived by. So I stopped trying to get back what was taken. I started building from what remained. I spoke again, but carefully, not to convince, but to stand straight. I worked, not for applause, but for alignment. I walked forward, not to prove anything, but because staying broken was no longer an option. People didn't notice at first. That was fine. Rebuilding doesn't announce itself, it whispers. Today I have less than before, but I am more than I was, because everything that defined me on the outside is gone, and I'm still here. They took everything except my name. And now, that name finally means something again. After everything was taken, people expected me to collapse. They waited for anger, for bitterness, for some loud reaction that would justify what they had done. But loss doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it sharpens you. When there is nothing left to distract you, you begin to see clearly. I noticed how much of my life had been built around permission. Permission to belong, permission to speak, permission to exist comfortably. I had shaped myself to fit rooms that were never meant for me. And when those rooms disappeared, I felt exposed, but also free. For the first time, my days were empty of expectations, no one waiting for results, no one measuring my worth, no one deciding if I was enough. The silence was uncomfortable, but it was honest. It showed me how much of my identity had been borrowed. I had confused recognition with value. I had mistaken approval for truth. Without those things, I was forced to ask a harder question. Who am I when no one is watching? At first, the answer scared me. I was tired, uncertain, still healing, But beneath that, there was something steady, something untouched by loss. Integrity doesn't disappear when circumstances do. Character doesn't depend on comfort. I began to notice small choices again. Waking up on time even when no one cared. Doing the work properly even when no credit followed. Speaking honestly even when silence would have been safer. These moments felt insignificant, but they were not. They were proof. Proof that identity isn't declared, it's practiced. Slowly, I stopped explaining myself. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer needed permission to be understood. I learned that clarity doesn't require an audience. Strength doesn't need witnesses. Some people mistook my quiet for defeat. That was fine. Real rebuilding happens below the surface, like roots pushing deeper before anything grows above ground. I wasn't trying to reclaim the past. I was refining the future. They had taken everything visible. So I built something invisible, but unbreakable. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing more, because I finally knew who would remain. Time passed, and something unexpected happened. I stopped waiting to be restored. At first, I thought healing meant returning to who I was before the losses, before the silence, before my name was almost rewritten by others. But the more days went by, the clearer it became going back was never the goal. The version of me that existed then had survived on permission. This one was learning how to stand alone. I noticed how people treated me differently when I no longer asked for space. Some leaned in with respect. Others grew uncomfortable. Not everyone benefits from your clarity. When you stop explaining yourself, you remove the leverage others once had over you. I no longer corrected misunderstandings. I let silence carry the weight. The truth didn't need defending, it only needed time. There were moments of doubt. Late nights when old memories returned without warning. Times when I wondered if holding on to my name was worth the cost. But every time I was tempted to shrink, I remembered what shrinking had taken from me. So I chose consistency over comfort. I showed up even when no one applauded. I kept my standards even when compromise would have made life easier. Identity, I learned, is not a single moment of courage. It's the daily refusal to betray yourself. Some doors stayed closed. I stopped knocking. Some bridges remained burned. I stopped rebuilding them. Not out of pride, but out of peace. I understood then that dignity is quiet. It doesn't announce victories. It doesn't argue with opinions. It simply walks forward, intact. They once tried to take my name by attaching it to loss, but loss had done the opposite. It stripped me down to what was real, and what remained could not be borrowed, traded, or taken away. I wasn't restored to my old life. I was introduced to my true one. By the time I understood what had happened, the fear was gone. Not because life had become easier, but because I had stopped measuring myself by what I no longer had. The world hadn't changed. People still judged quickly. Doors still closed without explanation. But none of it reached as deep as it once did. I had learned the difference between being rejected and being redirected. There was a calm that came from no longer chasing validation. I wasn't trying to be seen. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was simply living in alignment with my name. And that changed everything. I noticed how strength attracts silence. People don't always challenge you when you're clear, they watch. They wait. Some hope you'll break again so the story they told themselves can stay true. I didn't. I built routines instead of excuses. I chose discipline over motivation. I honored my word, even when no one would have noticed if I didn't. These were not grand victories. They were private ones. And private victories shape public outcomes. There were moments when old voices returned. You should be further by now. You lost too much. You'll never recover what mattered. But those voices no longer sounded like truth. They sounded like echoes. I realized something important. The people who tried to reduce me to my losses never knew my values. They only knew my position. And positions can be taken. Values cannot. I stopped reacting to disrespect. I stopped correcting narratives. I stopped negotiating my worth. Instead, I focused on becoming consistent enough that my name would speak before I ever did. Because a name doesn't gain meaning through defense. It gains meaning through behavior repeated over time. Whatever comes next, success or struggle, I know this. They may remember the moment I fell, but I will be remembered for how I stood back up, without noise, without bitterness, without losing myself. They took everything except my name, and I finally understand why that was enough. The strangest part wasn't what I lost, it was what I stopped needing. There was a time when I believed identity was something you earned back, through success, recognition, or proving people wrong. I thought one day I would stand restored in front of those who doubted me and feel complete again. That day never came, and I'm glad it didn't, because needing an audience is another kind of dependence. And I had already learned what dependence costs. I realized my name didn't need to be defended or elevated, it needed to be lived. So I chose patience over urgency, depth over speed, truth over appearance. I let time do what arguments never could. Some people quietly changed how they spoke to me, others disappeared altogether. Both outcomes felt honest. I no longer needed apologies. Understanding had become optional. Peace was non-negotiable. What surprised me most was this: I didn't feel hardened. I felt lighter. Loss had stripped away performance, silence had refined intention, and isolation had clarified purpose. My name no longer represented what I survived, it represented what I refused to become. Bitter, small, unrecognizable. I had learned that dignity doesn't demand closure, it creates direction. And even now, with no guarantees ahead, I walk forward steady, not because I know the outcome, but because I trust the foundation. They took everything except my name. And that was never a weakness, it was the beginning. There was a time when I thought the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing everything they worked for. I was wrong. The worst thing is losing yourself while trying to keep it all. And that is what almost happened to me. When everything was taken, I stood at the edge of myself, unsure of what was left. The titles were gone. The places were gone. The people who once spoke my name with familiarity spoke it no more. For a while, I believed that meant I was finished, that my story had ended quietly, without meaning or witness. But endings don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they disguise themselves as empty space. In that space, I finally heard my own thoughts without interruption. No expectations, no applause, no judgment worth fearing. And in that silence, I understood something that loss had been trying to teach me all along: identity is not what the world confirms. It is what survives when confirmation disappears. I stopped asking what I would get back. I started asking what I would keep. I kept my discipline when motivation failed. I kept my honesty when shortcuts tempted me. I kept my restraint when bitterness begged for a voice. I kept my name clean when it would have been easier to stain it just to be noticed. That is when I understood the difference between recovery and becoming. Recovery tries to restore what was lost. Becoming accepts what was lost and grows beyond it. The world remembers moments, but character remembers patterns. Every quiet decision mattered. Every unseen effort counted. Every day I chose not to betray myself added weight to my name, weight no one else could remove. I no longer needed justice to feel whole. I no longer needed recognition to feel real. I no longer needed the past to approve of my future. Some people will always remember me for what I lost. That is their limitation, not mine. Because I know what I kept. I kept my standards when they cost me comfort. I kept my clarity when confusion was encouraged. I kept my dignity when nobody was watching. And now, when I say my name, it does not echo with regret. It stands firm, with meaning, with history, with intent. They took everything except my name, and in the end, that wasn't mercy, it was truth. Because a name, when lived with integrity, becomes more than identity, it becomes proof. Proof that nothing truly essential can be stolen. Proof that loss does not define the end of a story. Proof that when everything is stripped away, what remains is who you were always meant to be. This is not a return. This is not revenge. This is not restoration. This is arrival. And this time, I did not need permission.